As you cautiously advance down the dimly lit corridor, the air grows heavier with each step. The floor beneath your feet feels uneven, but it's hard to tell in the flickering torchlight. Your eyes scan the walls for any signs of danger, but everything seems ordinary. Too ordinary. Then, with a sudden, sickening lurch, the ground gives way beneath you. The thin layer of stone and dirt crumbles, revealing a gaping pit concealed just beneath the surface. You barely have time to react before you're plummeting downward, your stomach flipping as you fall into the darkness. The walls of the pit rush past you, the faint light from above growing distant as you descend. You hit the bottom with a bone-jarring thud, the impact knocking the wind out of you. Pain shoots through your limbs as you struggle to catch your breath, the musty smell of the pit filling your nose. You're surrounded by cold, jagged rocks, and as you slowly push yourself up, you notice the glint of metal spikes jutting from the ground just inches away from where you landed. The realization that you narrowly avoided a grisly end sends a shiver down your spine. The sounds of the dungeon above seem distant now, and the darkness around you feels oppressively close. Bruised and shaken, you look up at the narrow opening high above, wondering how you'll manage to climb out. The silence of the pit presses in on you, broken only by the sound of your own breathing and the distant echoes of water dripping somewhere in the depths.
Hey man, you good down there? Still kicking, right?
Yeah, I'm fine. Just barely, though. Frickin' psycho's got spikes down here. I barely missed them.
Alright, well, you just hang tight. We're gonna figure out how to get you out of there.
In this episode of the podcast, we'll be talking about traps. How to use them, when to use them, where to use them, why to use them, what and who to use them on. Who wrote the script? Oh, me. Anyways, we'll be getting into the thought process of implementing traps into your campaign. The first question we need to think about is this: what are traps intended to do? In my opinion, traps are meant to serve as a deterrent. This spectrum of deterrents can be relatively insignificant or end in the victim's death, and everything in between. Do they always have to hurt you? The short answer is no. In D&D, it's as easy to put a teleportation trap into a dungeon as it is to put a pit trap in it. All of these traps are meant to deter the players from getting to whatever end goal they're trying to get to. These deterrents can manifest themselves in many ways: the loss of health, the loss of being able to perform ability and skill checks effectively, and even the loss of progress in regards to that teleportation trap that I mentioned earlier. Quite often, you'll see traps and puzzles tied hand in hand with each other. Typically, when a player messes up a step in a puzzle or fails it completely, they're rewarded with some kind of trap. Gouts of fire burst from the walls as you give the incorrect answer to the red dragon's riddle. The key thing to keep in mind is the intention behind these concepts. Puzzles delay, traps deter, maim, or kill. Why would you put a trap anywhere? Well, we've already answered that question somewhat. It's to deter, maim, and kill. But there's also another reason why we'd put traps in various parts of our campaign. It's to change things up. If we really simplify things, D&D and tabletop RPGs as a whole can be pretty much summed up into 3 types of encounters: combat, roleplay, and exploration. We could probably simplify it down to just combat and roleplay, but those 3 encounters map onto big archetypes of players that play the game. We have the players that love combat, the players that love talking to NPCs, and then the players that are kind of in between. They enjoy investigating everything about areas, searching for hidden loot, the meaning behind things, or just scouting ahead to do all of the behind-the-scenes stuff for the party. So how do traps tie into any of what I just said? Well, we can use them to enhance all of these encounters in ways that just make things a bit more varied, exciting, and fun. If I ran a campaign and every combat encounter just meant fighting until either the party or the enemy is dead, you'd probably get bored pretty fast. You're going to naturally learn the algorithm pretty quick, and once that happens, boredom kicks in and players start to mentally check out. Players checking out is something all GMs strive to avoid. Checked out players turn into uninvolved players, and uninvolved players can kill the vibe of a table. Traps are an easy way to shake things up. Suddenly, combat encounters aren't just a straightforward hack and slash until someone dies. Your team may get baited into a trap, and suddenly, the tables have been turned in the bad guy's favor. Traps can take low-threat monsters like goblins and kobolds and turn them into extremely deadly foes. Poison traps to hinder a player's ability to succeed on checks, or now, they take damage for as long as the player is poisoned. This can be especially deadly if they have no way of curing the affected player. Even if they can cure it, now we're talking about spells or potions being used outside of immediate combat. In other words, it's a resource drain. Exploration is now deadlier. There are pros and cons to scouting ahead or sticking your nose in places it does not belong. It turns into a team decision. Do we let this person go off on their own to get some intel so we're better prepared for the risk? Or risk them falling victim to a trap and they're forced to deal with the consequences on their own? Traps aren't as easy as monsters to identify, and the way to get past them may not be obvious. It forces the players to think slightly differently, and that slight difference is enough to keep the game interesting and keep players invested. Traps can even be enhancers for players who like role-playing. We just need to be a little bit more creative when we think about them. Your party's walking across the open plains. With the noon sun, you're able to see a mile or two in all directions. You might think a pit trap here makes absolutely no sense, but boom, the players fall into this deep, nonsensical pit trap in the middle of an open field anyways. What the heck? After a bit of time, a head pops into view at the mouth of the pit, and it turns out that it's a hunter, and he's been tracking a monster that's posed a bit of a threat to his town, which happens to be in the area. That's right, we can even use traps as a way to introduce NPCs and open up the path to a town or village they may never have gone to otherwise, and once we're at that point, the sky's the limit with the amount of directions the players can go. When we implement traps, we don't want to just slap anything anywhere and call it a day. Sure, the pitfall is a pretty safe choice for a lot of scenarios, but players will remember it more and appreciate it more if the traps correspond with the theme of the encounter, scenario, or dungeon. The traps you find in a goblin dungeon most likely won't be the same ones as the ones found in a wizard's tower. We're talking pitfalls, poison darts, and spike pits versus magic runes that explode on contact and potentially reality-bending traps. Pick the appropriate trap for the scenario your players have found themselves in. You don't want to have your players in this wizard tower dungeon climb, and your players are sitting there asking themselves why this all-powerful magic user is using a poison dart trap. It's going to make you feel dumb. Save yourself the trouble and find a better alternative. Speaking of alternatives and picking the right trap for the job, it wouldn't be fair for me to tell you to do that and not give you some examples to take to your campaign right after listening to this episode. So let's quickly go over a list of different traps, what they do, and how they can affect your players. Traps. At number 1, we have the Mimic Trap. That's when an ordinary object such as a chest, door, or piece of furniture is actually a mimic in disguise that attacks when touched. The effect of this is a surprise attack, grappling, and biting with potentially ongoing damage. This is probably my favorite trap simply because I feel like it gives me the most bang for my buck. You put this type of trap into the campaign a couple of times and everything that looks like loot will get the obligatory stab for the rest of the campaign. It's a trap that pretty much almost always permanently changes the way players think about an aspect of the game that they'll always encounter on a regular basis. Loot. Plus, it almost always creates just funny little roleplay scenarios as they debate opening up a chest or not. Trap number 2 is the pit trap. A hidden pit in the floor covered by a thin layer of material, such as leaves or dirt. When stepped on, the material gives way, causing the player to fall into the pit. The effects from this are falling damage, possible spikes at the bottom for additional harm. This is one of the classics, like I've said before. It's pretty safe to put in almost any dungeon. It gets the job done in a simple manner and is a good resource drain on the players. They can also be used as terrain features in maps and used to the players' benefits should they decide to lure things into these pits. It can also be a good way to separate members of the party and move players from one location to another. At number 3, we have the poison dart trap. Pressure plates or tripwires trigger hidden mechanisms that shoot poison-tipped darts at the players. Effects from this could include immediate piercing damage and a chance of being poisoned, leading to ongoing damage or disadvantage on certain rolls. This one's very straightforward. It's a good way to put a status effect on a player or the party as a whole. It's also easily tweaked to be effective against characters at all levels of play. You tweak the poison, and it hurts or doesn't hurt the party as much. Next at number 4 is the poison gas trap. A room or hallway slowly fills with poisonous gas when triggered by opening a door, moving a particular object, or stepping on a pressure plate. Effects from this can be poison damage over time, potential for suffocation, or long-term effects. This is a good trap because it does a lot of things at once very effectively and naturally. We can put status effects on our players, and we've introduced a built-in timer that forces our players to make decisions quickly. At number 5, we have the exploding rune trap. A magical rune or glyph that detonates when read, touched, or tampered with, causing an explosion. Effects from this could be fire or force damage, potentially affecting everyone in the vicinity. This is the type of trap you want to put to make your players just feel like they're in a dangerous area. Uh-oh, we're not dealing with somebody that's dug a few holes. We're talking about someone strong enough to cast this spell or with enough money and power to put that spell in place. Or it can make a place feel a bit more epic, like the players are exploring some long abandoned ancient civilization, and rune traps were just basic forms of security for these long lost people. Next up at number 6 is the teleportation trap. This is a magical trap that teleports the character who triggers it to a different, often dangerous location, such as deep within the dungeon or into a room filled with enemies. Effects from this could be disorientation, possible damage, or entrapment in a hostile environment. Another trap that's great for breaking up parties or shifting parties completely out of their comfort zone, or just moving them to completely different parts of the map really quickly. This trap can be safe, as in it's just a thing that moves players from place to place, or you can teleport them over a pit of lava. Either way, it's a resource drain and it's a great way to start an encounter. Finally, at number 7, we have the gravity reversal trap. When triggered, this trap reverses gravity in a room or corridor, sending players and objects hurtling towards the ceiling. Effect: falling damage when gravity reverses back to normal, or when players hit the ceiling. This one depends on your imagination whenever you decide to put it in. It can just be a cool little visual, the answer to a puzzle, or maybe your players are walking through a room that is absolutely littered with weapons on the floor. The trap activates, and now they're at risk of being impaled by all these different objects. I could go on and on about different types of traps, but that isn't the reason behind this episode. All I want to do is have you consider bringing more traps into your campaign, why to do it, the intent behind them, and give you a few ideas for some traps that you'll be able to springboard off of and create some fun traps of your own for your players. Consider putting traps when you're designing your encounters, basically. There's almost always a way they can be used to enhance the encounter and keep things fresh for your players. That concludes this episode of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you enjoyed it, then like, subscribe, and share the podcast with your friends. This is Myths, History, and D&D, and I hope you tune in next time.